Welcome to Fighting Failure, a podcast all about solutions for the climate crisis. This is episode 2, air travel, as part of our 4-part series on transportation. I'm your host for this episode, Oscar Archibald.
I'm your co-host, Hisham Kanan.
And I'm your other co-host, Sandhya Stapleton.
Make sure to listen to the first episode to get the full introduction on the transportation topic. There will, as always, be a link in the show notes. So, as a quick reminder, aviation makes up 12% of emissions from transportation.
Of these emissions, 40% is domestic, which could be replaced by public transportation, e.g. trains, we have trains, tram systems, taxis. People love their Ubers these days, so why not take an Uber?
Exactly, because on an Uber, the driver is always using their Uber. It's not really going wasted.
Of this, 60% is international, which is harder to replace. Business travel could be replaced by telecommuting or video conferencing. Leisure travel could be reduced or replaced by domestic holidays. And freight travel could be replaced by more carbon-efficient ships.
It's also important to reduce demand for overnight shipping and produce goods locally. So, with the introduction out of the way, let's talk about the issues with aeroplanes.
Airplanes emit carbon emissions. Simple as that. And the industry for airplanes are only growing.
So, airplanes emit, that is so true, but it's not only carbon dioxide. Airplanes emit a huge variety of poisonous and toxic chemicals into our atmosphere. Remember, if you look up at the blue sky and you see an airplane, it's got those big lines of white stuff coming out of the back?
Yeah.
You know that?
Yep.
Those are called contrails, and they are full of things that hurt our environment.
Oh dear.
They're not only your carbon dioxide, you've got your nitrous oxides, your sulfurous oxides, bits of water vapor that cause global warming from being so high up in the atmosphere. It's not just CO2. That's why we use the metric CO2 equivalent.
Yeah.
Airplanes create a huge variety of horrible emissions, and they not only emit in the high atmosphere, where they can stay for a long time and cause long-term impacts, they also ruin the neighborhoods which airports inhabit. So the area around Heathrow is quite polluted because of all these airplanes that are coming in and out of there so often.
And further, I would just like to add, just for those who, aren't 100% clear on what greenhouse gases are and how CO2 affects the planet, CO2 is a form of greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases, what they do is they trap heat in our atmosphere, which then, that causes multiple climate catastrophes, such as the melting of glaciers in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, and that causes sea levels to rise. So as you could probably guess, it could lead to global catastrophe, huge global catastrophe, civilization suffering. That's just a quick reminder for those who may have forgotten.
Yeah, it's a quick reminder of how entirely messed up this world is. But it's getting worse. The aeroplane industry is growing. More and more airplanes are taking off every year. And this is a huge issue because airplanes, I guess per person, airplanes emit huge amount of carbon dioxide. It's a huge amount of carbon dioxide and other horrible gases compared to cars and trucks and trains and whatnot.
That percentage is only going to grow.
Yeah, because it's getting more expensive. Sorry, it's getting cheaper. It's getting much cheaper to fly.
Far more affordable than it was 10 years ago, that's for sure.
And that means it's creating even more issues. And what's also really disappointing is a lack of government action.
Often cases, the routes which are becoming more affordable through the aerospace industry are actually the domestic flights, domestic air travel, and that's a huge problem because people think instead of driving for 4 hours or 5 hours, they can just take a 40-minute plane ride, and it costs the same amount as going to a gas station and paying for gas. But essentially, it's far worse for the environment to take a domestic flight. So the affordability of domestic flights isn't actually a good thing because it's promoting domestic flights, which is increasing it's significantly increasing CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, toxin emissions. It's really horrible.
It's just really disappointing to see how little the government is doing about this. They're bailing out all these airlines because of COVID. The airlines are clamoring for money and the government is just saying, oh, here you go, here's lots of money, here's tax relief, here's The government should be trying to kill the airline industry, not to sustain it.
Yeah.
But it's growing, and the growth of the airline industry is one of the biggest challenges we're facing. We want degrowth of the airplane industry. We want the airplane industry to tank and fall into the ground and die.
A little bit extreme, Oscar. A little bit extreme.
Okay, a little bit extreme. Even worse are the frequent flyer programs. Because what does a frequent flyer program do?
Encourages people to fly more frequently.
Frequent flyer programs encourage people to fly more. It's just like when you have loyalty points at your supermarket. It encourages you to go to the supermarket more. If you have a frequent flyer point, you're more likely to fly. And this is terrible. You're more likely to fly because you've got free. So it seems like the issues with the airplanes are not as much about that they emit. It's that the industry is growing. It's that we're getting more and more and more airplanes. I guess the reason that is a problem is, of course, because they emit. But the biggest problems we need to tackle is not the emissions of the airplanes. Because for what it's worth, airplanes are pretty efficient. There's not so much waste in terms of... Obviously, they emit a lot because you've got to get the plane off the ground. But once you take that into account, they're pretty efficient. And the airlines are getting pretty efficient. But the biggest problem that we're facing, and also it's probably more easy to tackle than trying to make planes actually renewable, is the issue of the growth of the airline industry.
Yeah.
You guys got any other problems you want to add? I've got a problem. Problem is they don't give me free food on the planes anymore.
Yeah, they make the planes cheaper, but raise other costs, like secretly.
Thank God that section is over. We've already covered the main problems with airlines. So now let's talk about the solutions.
Last time when we talked about EVs, we emphasized that they are not the silver bullet. However, compared to green technologies in the aircraft, EVs look very, very shiny.
I guess what you mean by that, right, is that you've got this idea of the silver bullet, which is one thing that will come in and change everything. And in the car industry, people conceive EVs to be the silver bullet, and we talked about that in our last episode. Because electric vehicles are basically an alternative to cars that work almost as well, except they don't emit while they're driving. At least we talked about production emissions in that episode as well. But when they're driving, they just don't emit.
The way that they it's basically what happens is, the emissions shift from being emissions via, emissions while driving to rather emissions from providing the energy if it's a non-renewable source of energy.
Coming back to aircraft, we just really don't have this sort of easy alternative that we do in the car industry. You can't have an electric plane. If you do the calculations, batteries are so heavy, and to have enough energy to take off, it's just impossible. It would have to be so heavy, you would need more, think about it, it's a bit of a snowball. If you ever try to have a battery to power the plane, you need more energy because the battery's heavy. But then now that the battery's heavier, to give more energy, you need even more energy.
Exactly.
And it's sort of impossible to have a proper big airliner powered off a battery because the batteries are so heavy.
Yeah.
It's just impossible. You can't have an electric aircraft. Electric aircraft are only possible at the really small scale. So you could have a model aircraft that's based on a battery. You can't have an electric airliner. You just can't. So this is why, as we were talking about before, it is so important to reduce the amount that we fly.
Yeah.
Because there is not these sort of alternative technologies. So, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, oil is a great fuel because it carries so much energy in such a small space in a small mass. And the problem is with that batteries just cannot get to that same level of that. So, I promised solutions, but here I really don't have that. My solution is don't fly. So no matter what technologies we develop, we have to reduce air travel.
It's just the same, with EVs, electric vehicles are a solution, but it doesn't matter. You can get your EV, but still the best option is to try and reduce the amount that you have to use a car, or even entirely stop using a car.
And it's even more important with airplanes. And so here I've written some awesome ways that we can reduce air travel.
To start off, I think definitely telecommuting is a great solution. There's so many people who a lot of domestic air travel is business trips, for business purposes, right? And to reduce that, you can join a meeting, just by opening your computer, opening whatever, Google Meets, Zoom, whichever application you use, and you can just open it. You just open it and you can be in the meeting, and it's that simple. There's no longer that need.
We're on a Google Meet right now. We haven't all flown to London to record this podcast. We're all recording from across the world. We're each in a different continent. something we can take out of COVID is that telecommuting has been proven to work. People are being forced to not take these business trips, and I think it's actually working out pretty well.
Local holidays are also a great alternative for traveling from place to place.
Yeah, I mean, here in the UK, we cycle a lot, so in my family at least, we often take cycling holidays, which sounds kind of lame, but it's not. I guess it's a bit like how you Americans love your road trips. We love our cycling trips. You really get to see the beautiful detail along these back roads rather than speeding along a motorway, and it can be really beautiful as well as being great exercise. You get to meet people, meet different foods. It's a really great alternative to a holiday that I think is really underrepresented in the media, as well as trains. I love trains. You guys know I love trains. You'll also, especially if you listen to the last episode, you'll know I love trains. As well as something I touched on earlier, which is about local beauty. So an example of this, last time I talked about like Cotswolds and Scottish Highlands. When we used to live in Australia, New Zealand is really beautiful and it's also really close by. But we never went to New Zealand because we were like, why would we go to New Zealand? It's so close. And now I've never been to New Zealand and I don't know if I ever will be able to go to New Zealand. So it's important to remember that places near you can also be really beautiful and you shouldn't disregard them. I mean, Hisham, you live in Malawi. What are some really beautiful places in Malawi or near Malawi?
So, I mean, we did a small trip to Tuma Forest. It's like an hour drive away. So if you get your electric vehicle, I mean, just take that. If you got a bus, whatever. But basically, there's these small trips that you can make which are much more efficient. Even though our traveling there emits carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, right? It's far more efficient than traveling all the way to Mozambique in a car, which is, so it's a long, like 1-day trip. Why would we travel to, we could travel to Mozambique. It's still a much more feasible plan than traveling all the way to Europe for like a 2-week holiday. But, the thing is, always stay local. It's a big part of, the climate debate. Staying local is really going to be what allows us to progress in the right way.
I actually went on a road trip to Mozambique and it is the most horrible thing. Do not go on a road trip to Mozambique. Just don't. Okay?
It's beautiful once you get there. It's beautiful once you get there.
How about you, Cynthia? Well, how about the Himalayas?
Oscar, let's be honest, Oscar. The Himalayas are completely war-ridden. There's no traveling to like the Himalayas. You can't go to Kashmir. You're gonna get caught up in some terrorist conflict going on there. Like you can't.
No, not Kashmir. I've been to the Himalayas. It's really nice. You go to Nepal.
Yeah, but that's not India. You're saying domestic, like within India.
It's kind of local. Like if you look on the big scale of things, you could drive with your electric car, of course.
Definitely, and I was talking to I have lots of Indian friends, and they talk about doing hikes up large mountains to make it to a temple which is built on the top of this forested mountain, and it just sounds so amazing. Like there's always this beauty, but you have to really want to discover it And I also want to bring up when I was in the US because of COVID. We were in the U.S. for a while, like many people who live overseas because of COVID. And while we were there, I'm from Vermont. I'm a Vermont enthusiast, as my friends know. And I've never experienced Vermont the way I experienced it. I went to Johnson. I went to the far north of Vermont. I just traveled all over, and I went to the lake. I did hiking. I hiked part of Mount Mansfield. I just did and I had time. Because I couldn't travel internationally within the U.S., so not internationally, but I couldn't, travel across, I couldn't travel across the country basically. So it was all domestic within my state, and I just found out so much about the state actually, and it was a great experience, and it made it that much harder to leave, and it's always hard to leave, but it made it so much harder this time, and I was just, it was really hard, but it was amazing to actually experience Vermont in its true form, and that's something which COVID has actually brought out for me, and I'm grateful actually.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last thing that we could potentially do to encourage local holidays is initiatives from the government. As you guys know, if you've been listening to the podcast or if you listened to the last episode, I love government initiatives, and I also think the EU is really good at them. And what would be great is okay, here's a bit of a sidetrack, but if you want to go to Oxford University, you have to pay much more if you're coming internationally than if you're a UK citizen. Could you do the same thing for tourist places? Could you make it could you have like tax relief for people who are traveling locally, who are citizens of the UK and visit sites in the UK, rather than people coming from abroad to visit the UK, who have to pay like a tourist tax, I guess, to sort of, I guess, pay for the carbon emissions that they've created coming to the UK from somewhere else internationally. So yeah, I think government initiatives could also help encourage this sort of local travel. If you make it cheaper, you make it more accessible.
But don't, that's also another thing. You can't encourage, it would be horrible for governments to encourage local travel then by lowering taxation, for example, on domestic flights, because then that's just encouraging air travel. So it has to be in a smart way, it has to actually be able to benefit.
I was thinking about sort of making sites of natural beauty like national parks free for UK citizens, but you have to pay if you're international. On the topic of government initiatives, let's talk taxes. There are lots of different ways we could use taxes to discourage flying. Just in simple, if you have a high tax on a plane, and I think there is a really good reason for having high taxes on planes. Is in economics, you've got this idea of the negative externality, which is if a company causes a negative externality or a bad problem that's not related to their business, they have to pay for that. And at the moment, we're really letting companies get off scot-free for creating this huge negative externalities, but really we need to pay it, and they need to pay for that, and a good way to do that is from taxes, so then prices go up.
Can I also add, I just wanted to talk about, there's a couple of countries that do this, and Switzerland's implementing tax levies on I think higher tax levies on tickets for planes, and if you're a private plane owner, there's high taxes. And there's also, taxes for owning something of that cost. So it just increasing, taxation on stuff like that. It really can help because no one likes taxes. No one sees, on their calendar, it's tax day, and they're like, woo, tax day, that's rocking, and that's awesome. But yeah, so people want to pay as little tax as they can. So increasing tax, like CO2 tax, on fuel, for example, that it's really, I think it's a crucial thing which the governments need to start implementing.
At the moment, the aviation industry is really floundering because of the lack of demand from COVID. So it's really disappointing that the government is bailing out these unsustainable airlines. We should let them die. Which airlines will come out on top after COVID? Those are the airlines that are actually good businesses. And honestly, I definitely don't want, I obviously don't pay tax, but if I were a taxpayer, I wouldn't want my tax money going to bailing out British Airways. That's not what I want my tax to go. I want my tax to go to building roads, helping people who aren't as privileged as me. I don't want it to go to bailing out British Airways because they weren't ready to survive a crisis.
Further, I'd want my tax money to go into, I'd want it to be, kind of divided between towns, districts, cities, so that they can make, they can make sidewalks, bike paths, they can make, trails through the forest, and they can build new trams, and I just that's the kind of thing which I would want my tax money going to. I wouldn't want it going to bailing out a airway.
In the UK, the government has actually got quite a few initiatives. They say cut net zero by 2050, no petrol or diesel cars by 2035. They've got some pretty serious climate agenda, but they're not really keeping to it. They've approved this Heathrow third runway scandal, which was struck down by the Court of Appeals, which would put the UK far over its targets. It's disappointing. I was quite happy when I saw these climate targets, but they're really not sticking to it. It's just a bit sad to see that. Yeah, it's sad.
It's true, and it's ridiculous. I just wanted to mention, the UN Paris Agreement, for example. There's all these huge meetings, I guess, debates, and where they come up with new resolutions, but really, are people paying any attention to that? Because you'll see, it was like 99% of countries failed to even meet their local goals. That's just it's kind of depressing, and it's even Switzerland, a developed nation who they're developed in an environmental sense, and they failed to meet their 2020 INDC, intended, I think it's, yeah, NDC, sorry, nationally determined contribution. And it is, it's just, it's sad that, but it's also good because by setting their goals so high, they're able to, try and force themselves to do better. And that type of development, it has to be forced. But to see that so many countries are failing to meet their goals, it's a sad reality.
Continuing with talking about sad realities, how about frequent flyers, which encourage people to fly more? Can I tell you guys my incredible idea? The inverse frequent flyer. The more points you have, the more money you pay. How about it? The frequent flyer tax. So you've got frequent flyer points is extra money you have to pay. I think that's pretty cool. However, it would be difficult to implement.
That's a fun concept, but I mean, thinking about the control of that, yeah, it's the it would actually have to be the airlines would have to implement that, and the airlines are all about making big bucks. They want to take home some cash, so they're not gonna be increasing.
Yeah, it's really difficult to implement. I mean, I was thinking the government could force airlines to do it because people could just switch between airlines or get rid of their accounts and make new ones. So it'd be really difficult to implement. But just as a thought, imagine a beautiful world with the inverse frequent flyer.
Yeah.
And then back to reality and oh god. So before we wrap up and move on to reviewing a piece of media, I just wanted to quickly touch on biofuels. So people think biofuels are cool and it's going to replace fossil fuels. They're not. They suck. It makes a huge amount of carbon emissions when you're growing the crops. Yeah. They're still burned and create emissions. They're not going to fix anything. They suck. So,
however, I entirely agree with you that in no way are they going to be making it, more environmentally friendly. However, in terms of sustainability, you can grow crops, right? And you can use biofuels for as long as the earth is still intact.
But how long will that be?
But fossil fuels are running out. They're depleting very, very rapidly. So they're more sustainable. However, they're not better. That should be, mentioned.
They still cause the same problems. Okay, so those are unfortunately all the solutions we have for the air travel industry. As you can see, the biggest solution is just to stop traveling by air. If there's anything else you want to add about the air travel industry, go to anchor.fm/fightingfailure and you can send us a voice message. If you do, you might be featured in a future episode. So last episode we had the Fighting Failure Video Club where we discussed 2 different videos about electric cars. This week we've got the Article Club. And so we've got an article from the New Scientist. It's called Hydrogen, Hoop or Hype. Unfortunately, I can't link this in the show notes. It's only available to subscribers of the New Scientist. I will link the New Scientist website below, and they also have a podcast, which I think might include something about hydrogen. If you do subscribe to the New Scientist, make sure to check out the 6th of February 2021 issue. That's where the article is.
If you have interest in learning more about how hydrogen could be an alternate fuel, you should definitely stay subscribed. We are going to be providing a video on hydrogen use, and just stay tuned, guys.
So there's a lot to discuss, and we will, of course, revisit this in much more detail in our upcoming episode on hydrogen, as Hisho just mentioned. So we're going to focus on the part of the article that talked about aeroplanes. So I've talked about it many times, about the energy density of different fuels. So hydrogen, as I've said, has an energy density far above oil, and way above batteries. So this is promising because hydrogen planes could fly for long distances, whereas a battery plane just cannot. And actually,
a 6-seater hydrogen plane flew in 2020. Also, Airbus has plans for 3 hydrogen aircraft. Really good. And none so far as large petrol. So there are no hydrogen aircraft that are as large as petrol ones yet.
There's an image in the article. If you have it, you'll be able to see it. We can see it's a prop plane rather than the sort of big turbofan engines that we see nowadays on jet planes. So it's clearly not going to be as, or at least at the moment, it's not as big and powerful as jet planes. But also the way a jet plane works is that it sort of sucks in petrol and explodes it out the back, and that's how it propels. But with a hydrogen plane, you usually use a hydrogen fuel cell to generate electricity, which then turns the fans. So it's sort of different there.
However, I just wanted to say, those small planes, though they're not very promising for international flights yet, domestic travel with those small hydrogen planes could be a potential form of travel, right? Because a 6-seater could carry people who want to go on a business trip.
Yeah, if you wanted to get like across the US, of course, like
to where they have to get at a much more sustainable way. So that's still a wonderful break.
Before we round up, I want to talk quickly about hydrogen supply. There are 3 types of hydrogen. Grey hydrogen, which produces a huge amount of fossil fuels, and it's clearly not what we're looking for. Blue hydrogen, which uses carbon capture to limit the amount of fossil fuels made during the hydrogen creation process. And green hydrogen, which is, as the name suggests, completely renewable. There's also a ton of issues about how to supply hydrogen. I'm going to save that discussion for our episode on hydrogen coming up soon. So that is all we have to say about the problems and solutions with air travel. Unfortunately, compared to electric vehicles, there aren't as many technologies that could disrupt the market in a really positive way, unfortunately. So make sure to stay tuned. Our next episode is all about global supply chains and how they can be decarbonized. See you next time on Fighting Failure.